The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
Faster by, good afternoon. Welcome to Mannin Line on Manx Radio. Today we're trying to get to the bottom of net zero. What it means for the Isle of Man, what some people think it means, what other people think it means. On Mannin Line today, Jon Curtis of Curtis Associates, and one of whose operations is Net Zero Matrix, so he'll know a lot about this, as will Andrew Langan Newton, who's the Secretary of the Isle of Man Green Party. So any thoughts on this? Text, email, call and WhatsApp. We're on till 1. And we're live on Facebook and YouTube as well. And faster by, Jon Curtis, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's great to be back on the Mannin Line again, together with my fellow comedian, Andrew Langan Newton.
All right, Andrew, how are you?
Guru Mayad, Andy, thanks for inviting me on.
Really good. Now, unfortunately, Lamara was due to be here, but couldn't be, so you've stepped in at the last minute. You're secretary now, is that right?
That's correct,
of the Isle of Man Green Party. What does the Green Party on the Isle of Man think of the government's net zero policies?
Well, we would like to see them move faster. I was on Manx Radio maybe in the last 3 or 4 weeks in response to something Chief Minister Cannon had said about postulating or just flirting with the idea that we might not hit our 2030 target, and we were in the Green Party very concerned with that. We see this being so many positives to net zero, and we should be aspiring to do it quicker than 2030. The 2030 target, 35% reduction in carbon emissions from the baseline.
There are about 3 targets, aren't there? There's one for 2050 as well. What are the targets?
You might say there's 4 targets. So there's a government target of decarbonising our electricity supply by 2030. Then there is the legal target under the Climate Change Act 2021. The interim target, first one, 2030. That's a 35% reduction in our baseline emissions. And then the 2035 is the 45% reduction, and then the 2050 net zero target.
Okay. How far are we along the line?
Well, I think the government updated its net zero website very recently with the 2022 figures for our emissions. So obviously it's difficult to say where we are in the middle of 2024, but we could look out in Douglas now from where we are on a vantage point on Douglas Head and see there's so many public buildings where the government have promised solar panels and we still don't see them. So on a prima facie view, face value view, we're seeing little progress.
Okay, there speaks an advocate. Jon Curtis, what do you make of netzero.im and the government's plans for this?
Well, there's 2 aspects here, Andy. The first one is the government's plans, and those plans are aligned with the plans of the United Kingdom and many other countries around the world, according to the Paris Agreement. But decarbonisation isn't possible without the full collaboration and engagement of companies. And it's where companies are involved where I feel the Isle of Man is well behind trends in other countries. I'd like to give you an example of Manx Gas, now called the Isle of Man Energy Group. You might remember a few years ago, it was actually in May 2021 that we all received a piece of paper through our letterboxes claiming that Manx Gas was carbon neutral. I thought this was, quite a surprise, because on the Isle of Man government's own figures, Manx Gas actually produced about 80,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. To offset that amount of carbon emissions would take an enormous project. So they had claimed that they were investing in a project in Costa Rica. So I did some investigations back then, Andy, and this history is actually important because I can talk about what's going on today as well. Mm-hmm. So Manx Gas, as it was then, Isle of Man Energy, is owned by the Islands Energy Group, based in Jersey, I believe. Yeah. And that company itself is owned by an enormous energy conglomerate called Ancana. At the time, neither the Island Energies Group or Ancana had any net zero policy whatsoever. So the claim that's being made by Manx Gas, who was owned by these companies, was completely frivolous. And when I looked into it, no such project existed. And in fact, Manx Gas retracted and changed their direction a few days after we spoke about this on the Mannin Line before. And as a consequence of that, they adopted a different strategy. But they certainly didn't apologise to the Manx people for grossly misleading them and sending another piece of paper through the letterbox which refuted their claims to be carbon neutral. So I have, Andy, if I may just finish, I've been tracking Encana together with thousands of other companies for the last few years. Most companies that household names that you will have heard of, BP, Shell, have made huge advances in reducing their carbon footprints. They have targets in place. They're reporting the information every year, and they are reducing their carbon footprints. Encana, on the other hand, is actually going in the opposite direction. On their websites, Encana's emissions have actually increased by 50% in the last 3 years. This is certainly not what we would expect to see from companies that are at the forefront of decarbonisation, such as Manx Gas, as it was.
Interesting, because the public is in the middle of this, Jon Curtis. Obviously, Andrew Langan Newton comes at it from a political point of view. You're in business. You're the person in the middle of all this, trying to negotiate it all. And the public really gets battered by statistics from all sides. It gets battered by PR from all sides. Can you forgive the public for, not quite understanding and sometimes just giving up, John?
Well, that's possible, but I mean, we can all do our part. I mean, I know Andrew's got his own elements in his house for reducing his own personal carbon footprint, and we can all do that. And it is encouraging to see many domestic properties having solar panels installed now. There's certainly more than the last time I talked about this, and that is encouraging. But I agree with Andrew that government needs to take a lead here and move ahead with installing their own renewable energy to reduce their own carbon footprint, to demonstrate to the public that they have the right to tell us what to do by adopting their own policies.
Yeah. Okay, Andrew Langan Newton, if a church, and I'm going to use words of one syllable, if a church is raising money for its roof, they put a big thermometer on the side of the church so people can see how far they've gone, how much money they've raised, how close they are to replacing the roof on the church. If the government isn't clear, A, in its targets, and B, how it's delivering, seriously, how can you expect the public to understand or engage with this?
Yeah, maybe I was just thinking when you were saying that image is very arresting, and maybe we should have a big one outside Tynwald on Prospect Hill, and the MHKs could come out with buckets and try and raise money for solar panels on the Tynwald building, because that's what we really need to see. We need to see the government taking transparent initiative on this. Yes, great. You were saying it's the wind farms going through a legal process now, and the public can engage with that legal process in terms of the planning application. But really, we've been promised these solar panels that we're going to be put on in 2024, and I think the public at large would really take enthusiasm from seeing it transparently taking place, like we're seeing on so many residential buildings now, and private businesses taking their own action, recognising their important role. As John's rightly said, it's a role that we all need to take as a community together, not just the government, but also the private sector. And the private sector are taking the lead on this at the moment, and we really need to see that further action from the government.
Okay, if you want to speak to Jon Curtis and Andrew Langan Newton, call, text, email, WhatsApp. You got some questions, something you'd like to know more about, and in particular what John's referring to, I think, is that called greenwashing? Yes,
as a matter of fact, I mean, I do congratulate the government for some years ago setting up a website which is netzero.im. I'll do my push there for the government. And there's a lot of useful information there for citizens to identify simple things like turning off lights at home and those sorts of things. And they publish a lot of information. In fact, there's a very good definition on that website of greenwashing itself, netzero.im, again, for those listeners who might want to go and look at that. And it says, greenwashing is where a company lies or exaggerates the sustainability of their product or services. There are many types of greenwashing. Green Green labelling is a marketing technique where mislabelled claims imply a product or service is more sustainable than it is. This may involve deceptive descriptions and buzzwords, and I refer back again here to what happened with Manx Gas when they did exactly that. So despite the fact that the government is suggesting that we should avoid greenwashing, we should identify and out the companies who are engaged with greenwashing, they still overlook the fact that one of the major companies on the island was implicit in doing that and never apologised to the Manx people.
Okay.
Andy, sorry, I'm just following on to that important point and just put my legal hat on for a moment. I mean, this is a very quickly developing area of law, and we're awaiting a case in the Netherlands at the moment, a case against Shell, or one of the Shell companies in the Netherlands, a tortious claim, so not a claim against a government, a claim against a private company based around their compliance with human rights, which is a very interesting case. Now, the Netherlands have a different legal system to the British and Irish Isles and the Isle of Man included in that, but that will be a very interesting case once it is ruled on. And we had a very significant judgment in the European Court of Human Rights earlier this year, and the Green Party wrote to the DOI Minister, Mr. Crookall, on the back of that in relation to Kroger and its compliance, and the Isle of Man government's compliance with that human rights judgment by extending the licence and by allowing Kroger to go on and drill, and that's been in the news very recently. We're still awaiting a reply from the Minister, and hopefully we'll receive that reply soon.
Okay, briefly, if you will, because there are lots of calls coming, but I want to just to talk to you first about two things: Kroger Gas and the Eristane wind farm. Jon Curtis, briefly, what's your view on those two?
There is a transition. Gas is part of the transition. It's a lower carbon footprint than other ways of generating electricity. It is required. I restate the position I had before on Kroger Gas, that provided the company can demonstrate their net zero strategy, they don't pull a stunt like Manx Gas claiming that they're investing in all sorts of tree forests all over the place, provided they demonstrate that they can decarbonise according to the government strategy, which is full decarbonisation by 2050, there is a role to play because we need energy. There's no question about that. So I work in the energy industry. I'm sure that Bonzo and others will be lined up ready to talk to us about this. I work in the energy industry and I am involved with many companies that produce fossil fuels, but they all have strategies and they're all working towards those strategies. And one of them is, Andy, what are called technology-based carbon removal techniques. These are where, instead of planting trees, for example, you drill holes in the ground, which requires a certain capability, and you actually gather carbon dioxide, compress it, and re-inject it back in the ground again. All over the North Sea, there are many projects already in place to do that. The only way, actually, to reach a balance of net zero is to remove large volumes of carbon dioxide. Nature-based solutions alone are part of that, but they're not the only answer.
Okay.
Just on that point, yeah, I would endorse the general thrust of what Jon's saying, but I would fundamentally disagree with him on carbon capture being a fundamental role in how we're going to achieve net zero. It might play a role on the margin, but not on the massive amounts of renewable energy we need to adopt and decarbonisation of the existing hydrocarbon industry. The second point is gas is a high carbon fuel compared to like solar panels or wind farms, maybe not against coal, for example, or oil, but compared against solar panels or wind turbines, it is a really high carbon emitting fuel.
Okay, I'm just going to get to the calls in just a moment, but and against a political party, surely the Green Party gets asked, why don't you concentrate on things that are more pressing for people in terms of cost of living, people getting stretched in terms of their living standards, health service and stuff like that? Obviously, to the Green Party, it's a raison d'etre to get us to a greener world. But you also have other policies as well. Are you neglecting those social policies for this green policy?
Well, maybe this is a multifaceted win, because what we know is the cost of living crisis was a fossil fuel crisis. The war in Ukraine, massive costs of gas pumped up all across Europe. America was slightly slightly different, but the European Union cost of living crisis, massive increase of costs, all came from fossil fuels being the baseline energy costs for all these things like food, like transport, and it all filtered through to the experience now. And what we know is if we generate our own energy with the cheapest form of energy ever, that's wind and solar and batteries as well, we know that that's going to solve that crisis for people. It's going to mean cheaper costs for people. It's going to be better. Then we look at places like Lord Street in Douglas, a huge cost for those communities in central areas with pollution, with transport pollution, and the huge increases of respiratory illness within our community. And we look at renewable energy, we look at EVs, we look at new means of transport around our community like active travel as addressing that huge cost for our health system for those individuals who suffer those respiratory illnesses. So this is going to solve actually loads of issues for our society, not just being some kind of statement that doesn't really do anything.
Okay, let's get to the lines then. And Julian's first on. Hi, Julian. You're live with Jon Curtis and Andrew Langan Newton.
Hi, Andy, and hello, Andrew and John.
Fast am I?
Yes, good day.
Hiya. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, so I'll get on with it. First one for John. Your businesses, I notice, are under a new group that you formed in January called EnergyLink.ai, which seems to lump together your carbon credit optimization, wind data transfer collection, and also oil data for oil rig operators. What I'd like to know is how many wind turbines worldwide are you currently providing this service for, and what is your business plan for the Isle of Man?
Well, thank you, Julian, and I appreciate the question. So in terms of wind turbines, we're currently processing the data for none. And in terms of business for the Isle of Man, I have none. I hope that's pretty clear.
So your investment in things like the Net Zero Matrix adverts for the last couple of years, and obviously your valuable time on the radio, why are you doing it?
I have been asked on to the Mannin Line by Andy Wint to talk about subjects that are important to the Manx people. That's why I'm doing it.
So it's altruistic?
Not at all. I'm not obliged to come here, and Andy has invited me, and I feel passionately about decarbonisation. I'm greatly in favour of it, but I am a realist. And realism involves the fact that it's a transition. You know, with the best will in the world, there is baseload problems. We still have to have a baseload. If the wind stops blowing and the sun stops shining, which does happen in the wintertime, we have to get our energy from somewhere else. The extra interconnector to the island is certainly going to help there. Whether or not that electricity that is purchased comes from a renewable source or not is something that needs to be looked into. It doesn't mean that there's an interconnector that in fact the electricity is green. It depends on the what's called the energy mix of the UK at that particular time and where the electricity is purchased from. And I think we need more transparency from the government about what they're planning to do there.
Right. So my understanding was, I think we spoke a while ago, I think you hail from Hampshire, is that right?
Okay. What's the question, Julian, if you would, please?
Okay. Just wondering why the Isle of Man, why EnergyLink.ai and Net Zero Matrix and everything is based on the island, if there's no kind of business going to be formed on the island. Anyway, I'll get to my second question, which can be for either of you. The predicted energy yield, known as the load factor, from the proposed Caervai wind farm at Eriestane is being published at 74%, which is 3 times higher than the UK government's published average onshore figure, which is 26%, and can be seen on the government UK website. The energy transition team have stated that they arrived at this model figure by applying wind measurements, which are currently going on up at Eriestane, and applying it to a wind turbine manufacturer's wind energy modelling software system. Can you explain how this can be when on the Manx Radio News yesterday it was announced that there hasn't been a wind turbine vendor even chosen yet?
Okay, Andrew Langan Newton.
If I could just respond, I refute the suggestion that I came to the Isle of Man to run net zero companies. I grew up here, I love the Isle of Man, and I came back here to spend my last days here. And I completely refute your suggestion that there's some other reason to do that.
Yeah, let me say, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more of them as well, John, last days that is. You've been invited on because you're in the business, and I'm fascinated by the fact that the business community is going to have to negotiate its way through this. Sure, there's a political side to this and often a cultural side to this. But business is key to this, am I right?
Absolutely, yes. And there are many companies on the Isle of Man.
Now, there's nothing wrong with making a few bob along the way.
No. In fact, generally speaking, I talked about carbon capture and storage. There is a pathway for those energy companies to make a profit doing it. If there isn't a profit, it's very hard to justify it because the cost then appears on the debit side of a balance sheet rather than the credit side, which is a revenue-generating mechanism. Just back to Julian's question. Neither Andy or I are really qualified to talk about the energy output of wind farms. That's a government statement to make.
Anyway, any comment, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Really valuable. Recycling this point that Mr. Burgess raised some time ago now, I recall. And what we know is that wind turbines have been improving. We know that the first wind turbine put up in the Isle of Man in 1958 was clearly not as efficient as the wind turbines they're talking about at Erie Stane. And you wouldn't be surprised at that in terms of learning curves and Moore's law, etc. And what we know is even over the last decade, we've seen dramatic improvements in the capacity factor of wind turbines. And so even in the data they're talking about from 2020, 2019, between the data the European Union is now putting out in 2024, which is showing the wind turbines onshore average turbines around between 35 and 45%. And so that's like the average area. And now Erie Stane is and you're talking about, I think, 26 or 28%, what Mr. Burgess was talking about, an average figure across the UK. Obviously, the Isle of Man, the Erie Stane has been identified by the Manx utilities based upon its exceptional quality. And Dr. Quirk was on talking last week, was it last week or the week before, Mannin Line, expressing that as well. You can revisit that for that further information. But what we know is that those figures are not stagnant, they're improving because the wind turbines are dramatically improving, and that's taking place even quicker because so many people around the world want wind turbines, and so the investment going into them and the technology improvement going into them is bringing out these fantastic figures that are going to benefit people in the Isle of Man.
Okay, all right, just a final word, Julian, would you?
Yeah, just a final word. I actually attended Santander Cafe yesterday with Ørsted, and they say that those massive turbines out in nice clear air, they're getting an average of 40%. So I fail to see how an onshore at Erie Stane can be double those.
Okay.
It seems impossible. But anyway, thanks for your time.
Good to hear from you. Thanks for that. Howard's with us now. Hi, Howard. You're live with John and Andrew.
Yes, just a question that either of your guests can answer. I think it was Mr. Curtis. Is it Mr. Curtis is there?
Yes.
Yeah, he mentioned about carbon and compressing carbon and depositing it more or less back in the Earth's structure, in the Earth's crust, etc. Yeah. Now, to do that, you're going to have to take the carbon that's in the air and from around the world, which will come back into the follow the void, and compress it. And that can only be done more or less on land. So where are you going to get the power to compress this into, I can assume it's going to be a liquid form, and it would have to be transported then to where they're going to inject it into the Earth's crust. And how much carbon is that going to produce? Because you're going to have, it's like having a blotting paper. You can have the blotting paper put down, but by the time you finish and pick it up, the ink is still there. And this is what's happening with the carbon, what you're talking about now. You're going to bury it, but it's still there. And the next person that comes along drilling for something is going to release this again, or it will find its own way. But also, why or how many people are out in India, China, Russia, and states like that who are producing masses of carbon dioxide How many people out there telling them to stop doing it and go to a more green environment?
Okay, all right, 2 questions there. The first one, if you would, and that is the industrial process of compressing carbon dioxide, presumably to liquid carbon dioxide, and sticking in a hole in the earth. Well, I mean,
so that brings in Julian's comments about energy efficiency. Some of the wind turbines that are in the North Sea now are taller than the Eiffel Tower. They're floating structures. One turn of the blade provides electricity for 100,000 homes in one day. The output is phenomenal. So for the energy that's required to compress the carbon dioxide, the most efficient way of doing it is to capture it at source. That source would be typically around the production facilities. So many of these production facilities that already exist, if the carbon dioxide is captured there, the compressor facilities to liquefy carbon dioxide are already in place, but what you need is energy to drive all of those. And by putting wind turbines together with the compressor facilities and being close to, there's no concern about these wells leaking again afterwards, because they're essentially depleted reservoirs, Howard. These are reservoirs that have produced in the past oil and gas, which are then at a lower pressure, and they're already sealed. The fact they must be sealed, because otherwise they wouldn't have captured all the hydrocarbons over those geological periods of time.
To a non-chemist, what's the process? How do you do this? How do you compress carbon dioxide to make it into a liquid?
It's a gas. So Andy's got a heat pump at his house, and a heat pump does exactly the same thing. It compresses a gas, and then by compressing it, it's creating energy, warmth, which is then pumped around the house. It's the reverse of an air conditioner. So you can do it for a gas. It's how an air conditioner works. The gas expands and it cools, and the air blows over that. It's a technology that's well understood from Victorian times. Okay,
not by everybody. Andrew?
So yeah, I've just remembered on Julian, helpfully, just go back his question very briefly, helpfully referred to Ørsted, and my understanding from a comment I've just recollected now, possibly from Manx Utilities, is that when they're talking about the offshore wind turbines, they are curtailed a lot more in terms of when there's draw on their requirement, and a big, 700 megawatt wind turbine producing energy, especially at peak yields, that might be turned down because there isn't the demand. So that's why their capacity factor is lower, more like 40%. Okay. Whereas if they were running all the time, they would be much more close to Erie Staying. Whereas Manx Utilities is saying Erie Staying is going to be drawn upon at all the time. So that's why it's going to have a much higher capacity factor. So that's just clear up that point. Now on China, what we're seeing from China, remarkable. They are the leader in the global green transformation, and they set a 2030 target. I think it was like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. August 2024, they're about to hit their 2030 target for green energy, for renewables. That's wind, solar and batteries and EVs. And we're sitting here pondering why the government hasn't put solar panels on government buildings yet, and they're driving ahead, and they produce 80% of the solar panels in the world for the consumption for countries like USA, UK, Europe, and we should be thanking them for investing in that and decarbonising quicker, so it's going to be cheaper for us.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Howard. Good to hear from you today. And let's go to Eddie, who's with us. Hi, Eddie. You're live with John and Andrew.
Hiya. You all right?
Good, thanks.
Same old, I'm afraid. First of all, can I just say to you a name? Jon Curtis, physicist, Nobel Prize winner. What do you think I'm going to say?
I don't know.
Using that name. I'm asking them to.
No.
No idea.
No, we don't know.
Well, a Nobel Prize winner, one of the most qualified people in the world.
Nobel Prize for what, Eddie?
Physicist.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, right. There is no climate emergency. Those are his words in 2022. Right, and that has been echoed by numerous amounts of qualified people, including one, I've forgotten the guy's name, it's George or something like that from South America. But he points out that if you go through the millennia and you look at the ups and downs of the CO2 levels, we're at an all-time low. We're not at an all-time high, so why are we concentrating everything on trying to be carbon-free?
Okay, Jon Curtis, existentially, climate change, and I suppose the question is, what's the point of it all?
Well, let's invite somebody from Ronaldsway Meteorological Station on and ask them about the trends in the increase in the global temperatures, and then maybe the question can be put to them, because it's quite clear that the temperature is going up. Yes, we're at all-time lows. Humanity's benefited from having very stable climates, particularly temperate climates, but the fact is it is going up. They estimated to be 20% more hurricanes hitting the United States this year, wildfires, droughts, everything. I think that most people, even Donald Trump, accepts the fact that there's a climate emergency going on, and and he's the one who most against it.
The thing is that the word emergency suggests something should be done right now. An emergency is somebody getting knocked down by a car or somebody falling off a cliff. Now, we can't do anything today about the climate.
Well, there's mitigation as well, Andy. Let's invite somebody on from Laxey, who all got flooded out a few years ago, and lost many of their possessions because of the very high rainfall at that time. The weather patterns are increasingly violent. They're increasingly longer periods of heat, longer periods of dry. Everywhere I travel a lot, and everywhere I go, I ask people and they say the same thing. It is a climate emergency, and it does need to be addressed. There's two factors. The government here is addressing climate mitigation. They're looking at flood defences, rises in sea levels. Andy, more comments on that from the
Yeah, maybe we should ask as well a Manx farmer on at the moment to understand how they are experiencing in 2024 the devastation to that community they're experiencing from the changing weather patterns in the Isle of Man and the disrupted rainfall and extreme rainfall and then the prospect of droughts, etc. And this is really damaging communities in the Isle of Man today, and we should really recognise that, as well as our global obligations and our current legal obligations in the Isle of Man. But even if we're all wrong, and we're clearly not by the mountain of evidence and support, data, scientific, etc., but even if we're wrong, look at renewable energy as a way of transforming our community to make lower respiratory illness, to make cheaper energy, to benefit our community in the Isle of Man. So actually, that is a virtue that we should also appreciate and should encourage us and resource us in driving this and not delaying today. Actually, we can take steps today, and action could start today.
Okay, well, Jon Curtis of Curtis and Associates and Andrew Langan Newton, Secretary of the Isle of Man Green Party. Get in touch. Text 166 177, email studio@manxradio.com. Call 66 13 68.
We interrupt this broadcast to inform all our listeners about the huge range of bathrooms and showers on display at Pacesetter. Yes, you all know that Pacesetter is known as the island's largest tile store, but I'm here to tell you that their bathroom displays are truly inspirational. Visit Pacesetter on Harris Terrace, where you'll discover a fabulous collection of stylish bathrooms. There's something to suit everyone, with design available. Pacesetter bathrooms and showers to show off about.
Have you visited Talbot & Sons' new home yet? After more than 30 years in Derby Square, we've moved to Snugborough Trading Estate with stunning new blind and curtain displays, inspiring ideas and the latest technology for your home, along with the same friendly family-run service and expertise you know and love. Visit talbots.im to find out more and come and see us soon.
Heating oil for homes, powering farms and businesses, keeping you moving with petrol stations across the island. Ellen Mannin Fuels. Call us on 844000.
Come and celebrate Manx life with 2 fantastic days of fun and entertainment at the Royal Manx Agricultural Show. This Friday and Saturday, bring friends and family and see all the best livestock on the island. Alongside shows and demonstrations, a huge selection of food and drink stalls, craft and trade exhibitors, and so much more. The Royal Manx Agricultural Show 2024, Knockalo Farm Patrick. Open 9:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. both days with ample free parking. Find us on Facebook or visit royalmanx.com for more information and to buy your tickets today. In association with Manx Telecom and supported by IFGL and your nation station Manx Radio.
For the first and only time this month, FC Isle of Man return to home soil this weekend for match day 3 of the new NWCFL Premier Division season. The Ravens host Longridge Town at the Bowl on Saturday night, with the Island side hoping to push on after earning their first win of the new campaign last time out. Join me, Rob Pritchard and Tony Mepham for FC Isle of Man versus Longridge Town, kicking off this Saturday at 6 p.m. Manx Radio will be providing full live match commentary on our DAB and AM 1368 channels. Live coverage of FC Isle of Man on Manx Radio is supported by Selton, investing in our community. The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
And Mark's with us. Hi, Mark. You're live with Jon Curtis and Andrew Langan Newton.
Yeah, hi Andy. I consider myself as a climate change moderate. I don't think it's a crisis, and nowhere in the IPCC report does it say it's a crisis. It say climate change is reality. But my main question is about what the panel think about anaerobic digesters, because I'm a bit of a cynic. I mean, caveat, I am involved in the energy industry. I work for an American energy company on the shipping side. And I travel an awful lot. I go to China, and Andrew, I take on board your comment with regards to the fact that there's a lot of solar and wind, but they manufacture it all. And I've also been to parts of China where you can't walk for not getting covered in coal dust, because they are also ramping up massive big coal panels. So the fact that they're actually investing in and using solar, and they're the biggest world manufacturer, I wouldn't actually say that's a benefit, because we just outsourced all our manufacture of solar and wind to China. But my main point is anaerobic digesters, because I don't think there's enough focus on this. They're proven in the UK. James Dyson, lots of other people have used it, and it could also help with our farming community. I've got no interest in anaerobic digesters, by the way. It's just the more I read and the more I see about it, it really does seem to be a possible solution. And I understand the studies. I've done a bit of research on the island. There's enough agriculture to actually use anaerobic digesters. We could put seaweed in anaerobic digesters. We could put even sewage, I understand, dried sewage can go in anaerobic digesters. And I just wonder why the Isle of Man or the MUA is not looking at it. They're just focused on wind and solar. And as a cynic, there's big business behind solar and wind power, but no one talks about anaerobic digesters, and I think it's a real opportunity for the Isle of Man and also the Isle of Man farming community. Okay. Just I get the panel's thoughts on ADs, Andy.
Okay, Jon Curtis.
Yeah, I think probably it would help actually if for the listeners, Mannin Line listeners, if you could just define what that is for us, so that we can then answer the question and people understand, well, what's the subject matter?
Okay, Mark.
Yeah, so anaerobic digesters, basically, they take waste, but also agricultural produce as well. They go into like a plant, and from the decomposition of any matter, there's methane gases which are actually released. And from that, you can actually generate energy in a simplistic way.
And this is all organic waste, yeah?
All organic. So everybody's complaining about seaweed on the beach. Take the seaweed, put it in an AD, and you can generate methane gas. It can be actually used for electricity. I'm not a scientist, by the way. I just have an interest in following it. And the more I read about it, the more it makes sense to me.
Okay, Jon Curtis?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the UK statistics for that, it's probably less than 1% of all electricity generation. So it's part of the mix, it's part of the transition. It has a role to play, but there's simply not enough land. And again, the question is, right, you produce methane, which is burned, but, people are going to argue, well, that's CO2 again. So you have to capture the carbon dioxide in that process through a scrubber or some form of chemical mechanism. For that to be green, the anaerobic decomposition requires the capture of the carbon dioxide and the subsequent sequestration.
And what do you think of his comment that people who represent wind turbine companies go hell for leather for wind, people who make solar panels say everything's solar, big business, I mean, let's face it, big business is behind this. There's a lot of money to be made. There are also government subventions and subsidies. I mean, how does the public filter out what is a sales pitch, Jon?
The cheapest form of energy is energy that's derived from solar. The cost of solar panels has come down. The Chinese, yes, and 95% of the solar panels are manufactured, but those that are produced today probably 100 times more efficient than those from 20 years ago. To manufacture the number of solar panels that's required to produce megawatts, gigawatts of energy requires a huge engineering effort. And to do that, you need investment. And to have investment, you need profits.
Okay.
So big business, whether it's small business, a farmer, with his anaerobic decomposition, or a big business, it's the same thing. They have to feed their kids as well, and they've got to make a profit doing the job that they have. Andy?
Yeah, no, thanks. I'd absolutely endorse what Jon said there. And yeah, like this technology, let's explore it. And if there's businesses out there who want to pursue it, yeah, go for it, because it's going to play a role. It's going to, I think Jon suggested as well, on the margin. And we shouldn't be suspicious about everywhere around the world now investing in solar panels and wind turbines. People make economic decisions based around price. There's a reason why people don't buy Kodak cameras anymore and people have iPhones. It's because the market system made the technology improve, and it made something better come along that was cheaper, that was more productive, and then we had benefited from that. And that's what we're seeing with solar panels and wind turbines, and a dramatic fall in price. And again with batteries and EVs, the figures coming out of China suggested the price of batteries, lithium-ion batteries, fell between 2023 and April 2024 by 50%. We're seeing a dramatic reduction in cost. And so there is more coal power stations going up in China, but what we're seeing is the capacity factor of the existing coal power stations being dramatically displaced by the new solar and the new wind turbines. And so that means the factories that are building the solar panels and the wind turbines are actually decarbonising, because the input of the electricity is less coal, more solar and wind now.
Okay.
It's a transition.
But just a general question. This is thank you, Grenville, who dropped a note in just to say, well, you talk about China, he said to Andrew Langan Newton, how can we believe a word that the Chinese say? Diplomatically and politically, there are adversaries, surely. Why do we believe what the Chinese say?
Yeah, so it's a different governance system from our advanced democracy, I would say, and everyone recognises that. But the governance system in China does require the patronage of the community at large, so they just can't go and hide everything from that community, and there is a difficult tightrope going on there. But what we can judge is what we're seeing, and the last caller, he said they had been to China and they'd seen both the smog, and that's well documented, but also I think they were saying more solar and more wind turbines going up, and we know with the satellites around the world we can see that beyond what China's publicising, but this is happening. Right,
Mark, you've been to China then. Does the Chinese government rule the roost? Can you believe what the Chinese government say?
Well, I lived in Shanghai for 3 years, so there was an AIDS epidemic. The Chinese government hid that. I lived there in China during the SARS epidemic. The Chinese also covered that up. So you can't believe a word they say. They're a totalitarian state and they're completely Marxist. So they don't have a social governance in terms of buy-in.
Now, are they going hell for leather for wind and solar?
Oh, absolutely, because there's an economic benefit. And again, China play the long game, and they're the biggest investor in, let's say, UK universities at the moment in terms of actually producing papers on climate change. And most people who get doctorates are determined in the papers they produce in getting financed. And there's a definite link there. And I'm not sort of saying there's not climate change, there is, but you have to be very, very careful when you talk about big business, especially when Chinese is involved. Okay. And coming back to Jon's point about not being enough land, I'm not sure that's factually correct. I'm not a scientist, I don't have the facts, but I have read a paper that there is sufficient land on the Isle of Man for agriculture, so I'll be interested to see why Jon doesn't think that's correct. And also the fact that there's only 1% of ADs in the UK. That doesn't mean to say the Isle of Man couldn't have more, because ADs don't have the big business behind them that solar and wind do. So I understand their point, but there's big business and there's big players in this, so you have to be a bit sort of less naive.
I appreciate your perspective on this, Mark. Thanks for calling today.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. 11
minutes before 1 on Max Radio. Mannin Line today with Jon Curtis and Andrew Langan Newton talking about net zero, how we get there, what we do, how much is it going to cost, and will we know when we get there?
When the Mannin Line's not on air, call Manx Radio to leave your opinion for broadcast on 682 631.
Ørsted want to build a 1.4 gigawatt wind farm 6 nautical miles off the northeast coast of the Isle of Man. Up to 100 turbines are proposed, and these could be as high as 389 metres above low tides. So what's in it for us? Seabed rental income, tax on the energy production, a community fund and potentially cheaper electricity are all mentioned, but will all these be delivered? Does the potential benefit in developing green energy outweigh the inevitable damage to marine habitats and views from the shore? Find out on Perspective this Sunday at 12 noon on Manx Radio with me, Phil Gaughan. Yes, it's Gone with the Wind on this week's show.
The Mannin Line with Andy Wint.
It'll be interesting this coming Sunday with the Ørsted people. We've only got a couple of minutes left. By the way, after Mannin Line today, it's a vintage Kelly's Eye. It's our 60th anniversary year. David Callister and Peter Kelly cast their eyes over a section of Peel Road in Douglas where a gap left by 2 Georgian houses was filled by a building with a Kentucky Fried door. I'm not joking. We've just about run out of time, Andrew Langan Newton, so I'm going to invite you and John back before the end of the year. We'll talk more about this. When will the public know that we've got where we need to get, briefly, if you would? Who do we believe? Do we believe the government? Do we believe big business? Do we believe it when the price of energy comes down? How can the people gauge this?
I think 2024 has been a really crunch year in this transition. Now we've got the data and we're going to see this in a pace that we can't even anticipate now, because it's really reeling up in terms of the falling price in solar, the falling price in wind, and the falling price in batteries. So this 2024 is going to be a big year. So when we get into 2025, the roller coaster is going to be running, and we're all going to be excited for what's going to happen.
Okay, Jon Curtis.
Yeah, I think we need more visible participation of the government's intentions, and I echo Andy's early opening statement about proceeding with installing solar panels on government buildings. That's a very good visual representation of intention, which is currently lacking.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So in terms of, and again, politics as well, we've heard, and again, we the public are in the middle of a global village, and sometimes you don't know who to believe. Do we believe the Isle of Man government, Jon Curtis?
Yes. Yes, they do employ independent consultants that monitor, calculate, and publish the Isle of Man's public footprint. They are separate. They are standalone. I think we can trust the figures, but figures can be presented in different ways. I still think we need better engagement and more, not just every year, but maybe every month or at least every quarter, some update on the progress that's being made, rather than having to wait for statements now and again from Tynwald.
Andrew Langan Newton?
Absolutely, we can agree with them, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be aspiring more, like the Chief Minister, which I was on Max Radio a few weeks ago talking about. And also, that's what we should also have better accountability in our Tynwald system, in our legislature, holding the government accountable. The Green Party on the record has material concerns about the separation of powers between the legislature and the government. The MHKs should be holding the government accountable and the ministers accountable, but when we've got this kind of blurring between too many MHKs in government, then we lose that accountability.
Okay, Andrew Langan Newton will be standing for Keys in 2 years' time, I take it?
I stood last time, and that decision will be taken a year before. But the Green Party will be running candidates, and we're now inviting people to come to greenparty.im and find out more about the party.
Okay, find a word for...
Yes, how about inviting some sixth formers along, or some young people from the schools, and hearing their point of view, because they inherit this whole mess after all.
Okay, thanks for that, Jon Curtis. And Andrew, next time we're out and about with the Mannin Line in the schools, I'll put it to them. If you want more information, the government's net zero website is netzero.im, and Mannin Line's back tomorrow with an open line. Thanks to Ben Hartley on the phones today. Oh, by the way, on Friday we're live at Nokelo for the Royal Manx Agricultural Show.
WINT
years serving you as the nation's station. This is Manx Radio.
Kelly's Eye, brought to you by Ellis Brown Architects.
Peter, what's Kelly's Eye looking at today?
Today, David, a Kentucky fried door.
A Kentucky fried door? I think you've got me a bit puzzled there. Go on.
Well, we have to go back quite some time, and Gavin Stamp, who I'm sure a lot of listeners know of, his wife Alexander wrote a book, and it was called The New Georgians.
Oh, right.
And it was basically heading for conservationists, and it described various societies. And there was the Sloane Rangers, people who lived in Sloane Square and what have you. Anyway, these doors, which I think were made in Taiwan or something, there was one which was called the Kentucky. And the Kentucky was a hardwood door, but it had a built-in fanlight. Well, of course, in architectural terms, the fanlight goes above the door, not within it. So she coined this expression, the Kentucky Fried Door, from Kentucky Fried Chicken. Well, here we are in a building, which is a new building, and I have to say it blends in very well. And they've gone to a lot of trouble to replicate architectural styles from adjoining buildings. But lo and behold, they fall into the trap of putting a Kentucky Fried Door right in the middle.
Yes, and spoiling it?
To me, yes. Yeah. We're in Peel Road in Douglas. We're in that section from the top of Pank Hill, between there and the bottom of Hope Street. And on the town side, as opposed to the railway side of the road, a few years ago, two rather nice Georgian houses, and they were a very good example of that period, were demolished, leaving a gap. And now the gap has been filled by a building which I'm uncertain, I thought it was being built for office accommodation, but it's got several doorbells, so it's quite possible it's actually been built as apartments. But no, here we have a building which, although it's not the Georgian building that was there, at least it blends in. And it blends in nicely because somebody, and I don't know who the architect was, has taken the trouble to say, what have we got around us? They haven't done it exactly the same as Pearson's. The bay windows haven't got slate roofs, and the windows haven't got those rather heavy margins. What they've done is put a dripstone instead. But no, it's one that I'm pleased with.
Many of the most iconic buildings around the island have been designed by Ellis Brown Architects. Keep up with Ellis Brown today on Facebook or via ellisbrown.im.
Part of island life for 60 years. This is your Manx Radio.